webinar today in the sense that it'll be a bit more theoretical than the usual CRN webinars, but I'll give a decent amount of information on why it's practically relevant. So the broad idea is to debunk the notion that sport is partially or fully meritocratic, and cricket in particular, and that is all I'm trying to prove and demonstrate through the usage of cricket as an example. So to demonstrate that, the first idea would be to define the term meritocracy and what it means. And it is quite a nebulous concept. So that's what I'll try to do first, to understand it and what it means and how then it applies to sports. And particularly why it has been called a myth, and does that myth apply in the sporting context as well. Then I'll quickly talk a bit about why sport is considered meritocratic, and then move on to cricket as a case study of why we can demonstrate that sport, and cricket in particular, suffers from the myth of meritocracy, so to say. And lastly, I'll close with a bit of relevance of this discussion and why this theoretical exploration into the idea of merit and how it applies to sport and cricket matters. So starting with the idea of meritocracy itself, it has stumped philosophers for centuries. And it's funny that the idea predates the term, in the sense that the broad idea that ability, talent, or effort should guide societal decision making has been in existence for over 2,500 years. Perhaps different societies have allocated leadership positions, resources, so on and so forth, based on uh, ability, leadership qualities, talent. But the term meritocracy itself, or merit in the sense that we use it today, perhaps is only about 70 years old. The first known usage is 1956 by Alan Fox, a British academic sociologist, philosopher, who used it in a very interesting way, in a way to critique the concept itself, the idea that in a future society you will have and just to go back to this Amartya Sen saying, the idea itself has many virtues, but clarity is not one of them, which is what I was trying to say. So yeah, Alan Fox uses meritocracy to critique the idea itself, that in a future society it will be allocated the societal resources on the basis of just things such as effort and talent. That is critiqued, and over the course of the past century, particularly the past half a century, the idea has been used in multiple ways. Some people have used the idea of meritocracy to describe existing state of affairs. Some have used it to say how the society should be. Others have used it to describe a social system. Some others an ideological discourse, and as I said, some to use it as a critique itself. And that is how it starts. For the first 20 years till the 1970s, that is how the idea was used, as a critique. This is Hannah Arendt in the 1950s talking about it, in the sense that it is not necessarily a great idea to organize societies based on just ability and talent and effort. So the idea was that this will just transform existing feudal societies into plutocratic societies. This is another philosopher, Raymond Williams, talking about it in the same ways. The fact that intelligence can be measured is not necessarily true. And the picture in the background sort of indicates that in some ways as well. But the idea began to take a different shape in the 1970s, when it started to be used more in terms of the idea of American dream, that if you have the talent and the ability, and if you apply all the efforts, then you can get whatever you want. And that is how the idea progresses, in the sense that if you have talent, great, you should get rewards, perhaps fine. If you work hard, you should progress in life, perhaps fine. Similarly, other things like attitude or integrity and moral characters, all acceptable ways of perhaps describing and allocating societal resources. And then we start to see in the last 30 or 40 years philosophers and historians and sociologists working on it and trying to see whether this has actually worked in this way or not. And then we see that there are two other things that have actually been greatly responsible for how societies allocate resources and positions and so on and so forth. One is the idea of competitive individualism, which is that if you need to get something, you need to get ahead and leave someone behind. So the idea that if you need to progress, somebody needs to be left behind, which is perhaps okay for some people, not necessarily. We can debate that, but that's what the existing situation is. And then, most importantly, the idea of privilege, which is where the discussion will concentrate a bit today, in the sense that if you get ahead in life, it is not necessarily just because of your inborn talent or ability or the hard work that you put in, but a lot of socioeconomic, cultural, political capital. Uh, the best kid doesn't necessarily mean that they're the most hardworking. They might be, but then it also means that they could have parents who could have put them through expensive education, coaching, training, resources. And I guess you probably know where I'm going with this and how this applies in sports. We can instantly think about it, right? We'll come back to that. But first, why? So that is the broad idea of merit and what it means and what it includes, but perhaps should not, the idea of privilege, for instance. So why do we think that sports is meritocratic? If you haven't already thought about it, notice next time what commentators say, what writers say about sports, sporting achievements. The word merit is thrown about very frequently in sporting debates. It is considered and taken for granted that somebody who is winning, somebody who is getting to participate and play at the highest levels, at the elite levels, is deserving of it, is meritocratic enough to deserve that position of in a particular team, deserve a quota at the Olympic, or so on and so forth. Uh, because and this is why so many metaphors which use sport, right? The idea that sport provides the right kind of situations to rise up, the idea that sport provides equal starting lines. You start from the same starting line. The 100-meter race, for instance, is used as a very common metaphor for sport and for life. The idea of the level playing field as well is one of the closest and the commonest metaphor used for life and for sport. But is it really true that these things exist, as this picture demonstrates? Ladders are not always equally available for all people. They are broken, or they are just different because different people have to go through different hoops. Starting lines are also not necessarily equal. This is what the first picture of the presentation showed. People, because of their resources, as I said, privilege, can have different starting lines effectively. And level playing fields also don't necessarily exist. Funnily, in the game of cricket, the home of cricket itself is not a level playing field, which might be a good metaphor for what the game itself does and shows. As we perhaps all know, what the Lord's cricket field looked like. It's a not a level playing field, right? But then going into a bit more about why this impacts cricket, but this exists, this notion that sport is the last bastion of meritocracy. People feel that every other place in society is has been made impure, to so to say, through social engineering, but sport does not do that, and that's why sport is the real merit, is a widely held belief in commentary. And next time I'm sure you'll notice it in what you read, what you hear about sports, and generally society as well. But going to cricket, just to demonstrate how this idea applies in cricket, and why it's important. And I'll show it to three examples. The first is the idea of measurement. Meritocracy assumes that there can be objective measurement of who is better. Does it really work, in the sense that does sport and cricket show this? Perhaps not always, which is maybe a good thing as well. So nothing to suggest that it is a bad thing, right? Most common example that is often cited is two English cricket batters, Michael Vaughan, former captain, Marcus Trescothick, both who had pretty average first class records, so to say, when they were given their international debut. And the idea that these players could go and do amazing things at the international level, they were chosen for their grit, their potential, their spark. And that's not objectively measured, right? Leadership in cricket, for instance, is again something that you see in a particular player. You think that they can be the captain, and captain plays a very important role in cricket, like unlike some other games. You just have a vibe about it, right? So similarly, a lot of people are not selected despite having amazing records. They never go on to play international cricket. Amol Mozumdar from India, the highest run getter in domestic, never played for India, for instance. And again, as a team sport, it becomes difficult to measure in the first place. So that adds interesting sort of complications as well. But again, measurement is not always necessarily objective given other factors like weather, which can play a big part in the record of some players, for instance, or what they were able to do on a particular day, toss, so on and so forth. So many different things that can go wrong or right and can take a hit at the numbers. So measurement doesn't really always do great things, and that really impacts the idea of, uh, so to say, meritocracy that we have a large belief in. Then second example is the idea of selective benefits or glorification of elites. The picture is just the last match played by Julian Goswami at Lord's. I was there, and this match is famous for one of the interesting debates on spirit and getting the non-striker out. Anyhow, so the idea that there is merit is again questioned when we see who gets what for doing the same things, and we have seen a lot of recent debate on how a lot of teams have started giving equal match fees, which is great. ICC has also announced that equal prize money will be available for winning the tournaments. But then if you dig a little deeper, you see the disparities start to exist. Annual retainers or the contracts are not necessarily always same. And this is an example from India. The current annual contracts for the men and the women, and you see the vast disparity in that. Even if men and women were to play same matches, despite the equal match fee, they'll not get the uh, same fees because the number of matches that women play is much less, the number of tests that women play is much less, so on and so forth. There's also glorification of elites in other ways, paying so much more to certain players as opposed to other players, and this impacts what players get at the lower levels of the game, and the overall sustainability of the game is affected by that. There's often an argument made for lack of investment in women's game, and the fact that sponsors and broadcasters are not coming in. But then that leads to a questioning of the functioning of cricket boards themselves. Are they there to make money, or are they there to grow the game and to make sure that the game is equal to everyone? So those things get affected, and that has implications for the idea of merit. The third one, again, we can probably discuss an entire webinar on this and entire days on this, and I don't need to sort of quote any new data here. You know all about the eliteness of the game in this country, for instance, and this is a quote from Wisden. So much more available in the ICEC report as well. You know about it, so I will not go into the detail of that. It's something from my own work about Indian cricket, which was published 5 years ago now, to suggest that it's not representative at all of the composition of the population. This figure 290 has now increased to 314 as of today, and it still remain 4 who have played from the scheduled castes and scheduled tribes. We can cite innumerable examples, and I don't need to go into the details of this, but the idea being that at its origin itself, cricket is an interesting game because of the distinction between gentlemen and amateurs and the batters and the bowlers. And that also is seen in who gets to become a bowler, for instance, and who gets to become a batter. In most cases, it is seen that people from underprivileged backgrounds have been able to become bowlers much more relatively easier as compared to batters, for instance, given the difference in the training and the equipment that is needed for the two roles. But what does this do for and obviously we have a lot of people coming through the structures to defy the odds, right? And that is often used as a story in cricket or sports generally, that it's all about the vibes, right? Or about stories. We love to see great stories of people who have transcended their background, and sport and cricket is often seen as a means for social mobility, right? It works for some people, but it doesn't for the vast majority. And often the stories of the people who are able to transcend their realities is used as an example of what cricket can do or what sport can do. And that leads to an ignorance of all the structural barriers and the issues that exist, which really need to be taken care of. And why this is a problem is because of this belief in the idea that meritocracy exists, the generations being lost to the game. somebody is best at the game, not amongst everyone, but amongst the people who are able to transcend their situation and were able to come to the top. So that is the idea that we need to take away, and why this matters. This discussion on merit and this idea that sport and cricket is not meritocratic. It matters because it can determine how we educate ourselves, how we educate our children, how we educate the people in the game, what they feel about themselves, and what they know, and what they consider as their contribution, and what they deserve. And that has important implications for the language they use. Some people who say that they deserve everything, or some people who say that they do not deserve something, it has implications for the dignity of work and the dignity of the individual. When we know that what we could achieve is not just because of our hard work or talent, but a lot of effort from a young age, and privilege can have bigger consequences for that. That also plays into the public discourse of how we consider these issues, and how we think about these issues, and how we think about uh, taking measures to equalize things in a real way. And that obviously then has an implication for policy making, how we think about these issues. If we consider that uh, things are not right, that people are getting to the top or not getting to the top because of these barriers, then that has implications for policy making. Then we start using less of the terms of merit to justify the existing state of affairs. And then obviously then we can talk about the overall place of sport in our societies, and what it can do for the larger societies, and things that happen in the sport can influence the society, and so back and forth. So in that sense, this discussion and this education on merit and how we conceptualize it in sports and cricket can help us change the debate slightly and make things a little more acceptable as to why we need to change. And that is all the idea that I have today. Thank you so much for listening, and I will be happy to hear from you and discuss. Thank you.
Thank you, Shubham. I'm just going to stop the recording.